Morning everyone, thanks very much Neil. Can everybody hear me? Roughly? Good, excellent. Okay, so being first on today, I'm hoping I won't sort of descend IAF stand into chaos for the remainder of the day. Hopefully I'll be able to give you a bit of a view from HSE about our sort of perspective on work at height and some of the issues and trends. My background is I'm not an operational inspector, so I'm not somebody who's out there inspecting access equipment or investigating accidents. I work very much in the sort of regulatory side of things, so looking at what we can do, taking in the information that we have about incidents and fatalities and how we can work with organisations like AIF to try and sort of get messages out there. So that's a bit about my sort of background. As Neil said, within my area is slips and trips and work at height, just because, as I'm sure you all know, a lot of falls from height are caused by somebody having a slip or trip to begin with, so it's very much fluid between the two. What I'm going to cover this morning then is a little bit about sort of the scale of the issue, so what's the issue that HSE still thinks needs to be dealt with. Reflect really on the impact that it can have. I'm sure everybody here has had experience of this or knows somebody who's been affected by an injury at work caused by a fall from height because of the areas that you work in. Look at some of the incident trends for last year. So these are the very latest statistics for 2009-10, the provisional statistics, and just share with you some of the industries which continue to sort of feature near the top, and also have a look at some of the agents that we know are involved in causing these falls from heights, or not necessarily causing them, but they're certainly involved in the incident when it happens. Have a little look at some of the common factors and control measures, and then as much as possible, I say for any public sector organisation at the moment, have a think about what are our sort of our priorities in the future. So a little bit of crystal balling, but having a think about some of the things that HSE is still concentrating on, and some of the areas which, again, I'm sure many of you are aware are growing issues and things you'll certainly be aware of from what you do. I think one of the things to sort of reflect on at the moment, it is a time of challenge and change for HSE as a regulator. And I think in many ways we're focusing on the opportunities that presents for us. We have to find new ways of working. So coming along to events like this, working closely with Access Industry Forum, as Neil says, on things like the weight tool, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on, and the review of the RIDDOR criteria, it's really quite fundamental now to how certainly HSE works, but I'm sure how all public sector organisations work. So just to have a little look then at the scale of the problem. Not surprisingly, falls from height remain the most common cause of fatality at work. So last year we had about 37 fatalities. In previous years, the number's been up in the 50s, and with fatalities, it's very difficult to say whether or not there's a downward trend in fatalities. I think probably the sort of the leap down from in the 50s to in the 30s is probably linked a lot to economic factors. So we've all seen large sort of construction works and home building programs effectively stopping. Some of them are restarting again, but probably there has been a link there between the number of fatalities that we've actually seen happening on site. Over 10% of all falls from height continue to involve a ladder, and I think again something HSE is quite strongly, emphasising all the time now because it keeps coming up, is the importance of using ladders safely and making sure they're not damaged when you use them. There was a lot of speculation when the regulations came in that HSE had banned ladders. And this sort of thing, it comes up time and time again. We get it in through our press office, we get it, calls coming into my team. Can't sort of stress this enough, HSE certainly hasn't banned ladders. And in fact, certainly colleagues in construction, when they're looking at types of access equipment that people are using, often they come across people using something more complicated, when in fact a ladder would actually be the most appropriate equipment for the job. So, having said that, there are risks in using any sort of access equipment if you're not using it properly. So I think that's sort of the main thing to think about there. And probably the 10% there is because ladders are quite easy to get hold of. They're quite cheap access equipment, so people will readily just grab a ladder, climb up it without perhaps checking that it is the right bit of kit to use, whether or not it's safe, and then we see these sorts of accidents happening. Over 60% of fatalities are in the construction industry, so again, work at height predominantly is a real risk in construction sort of every day, and that's where we see that the main injuries and fatalities happening. One thing I will say with some of these stats that I'm going to share with you is that they'll be slightly different to the things that you'll see on HSE's website. What we did was that a couple of years ago, slips and trips downstairs were recoded as falls from height, and it's not particularly relevant except that if you were here last year when we were talking about statistics, the overall numbers of falls from height would have been much lower, because falls downstairs, which now fall under this sort of grouping, are quite significant. And basically about 40% of all falls from height are actually somebody falling down a staircase. So if there's any sort of discrepancies between what you see on the web and what you've heard before, that really just accounts for that. But over the last sort of 5 years, in terms of major injuries, irrespective of the overall increase because of this slight recoding, we've seen major injuries reduced by about 300, which is a good number. And then over 3-day accidents have come down by about 1,000. So these are really quite significant numbers, and this sort of downward trend is being sustained, irrespective of other little sort of fluctuations that we see during each year. And then just finally, I was talking to a colleague in construction just to get a sort of a view around their experience as an inspector of some of the common things which are leading to people having falls from height at work. And I've just sort of summarised those. It's things like ladders and scaffold. And again, I would say the access equipment issue there is to do with people not knowing how to use it. It's certainly not to do with the equipment, generally speaking. Working platforms and roof edges, which I know you're being discussed later on today, people not using edge protection, and there's a picture I'll share with you a bit later on where you can see the sort of, the impact or implications of that. And then particularly people falling through fragile roofs or working near fragile roofs. And increasingly now, where we see the fatality reports come in, a lot of these are people working by themselves. And the impact there is quite significant. It's quite emotional in a way, because somebody's going to work to do a quick job on a roof, and then they're just not coming home, and their family or their partner's ringing up and saying, well, we don't know where they are. And on more than one occasion, somebody's then just been found the following day because they aren't working with somebody, they're supervising their own sort of work. And this is where sometimes corners can get cut, people can use the wrong sorts of protection, the wrong type of access equipment, or just not be aware of some of the risks that you can have of just working, at gutter height, or perhaps working near these fragile roofs. In terms of what we've sort of done so far, about a year after the work at height regulations came in, HSE did review them to have a look at how they were being implemented and some of the impacts. And then about a year ago as well, there was a select committee basically looking at all sorts of regulations, and the work at height regs were pulled in as part of that. So we had a look at that sort of feedback just to see, what people's impressions were of the impact of the work at height regulations and what changes they could see going on in the industry. And as I say, we've seen a sort of a steady decline in the number of reported injuries. And I think one of the noticeable things here, and I'm not sure if anyone here works in areas such as retail or perhaps sort of road transport and that kind of thing, but increasingly working at height, it isn't just seen as somebody working on a construction site or carrying out perhaps construction-related maintenance. It's really beginning to be seen as people stacking shelves in a supermarket. Because again, we know that the impact of having a low fall sometimes isn't that different from the impact of having a high fall. People can suffer really serious injury, excuse me, depending on their sort of health, if you like, before they carry out that work. And also walking across sort of the tops of trailers and jumping down from vehicles. Again, these are all sort of falls from height where people won't necessarily think about what they're doing before they're doing it. And we're seeing a lot of people now starting to consider that as work at height. So if they're climbing across the top of trailers, they think about a bit of edge protection, or they think about how they're going to attach themselves, particularly if it's a very high vehicle, any of the sort of risks with that. Equally in supermarkets and the like, people are starting to think more about, having step ladders and just making sure staff know how to use a step ladder. I mean, it sounds very straightforward, but actually it's quite an important thing that somebody knows what to use and they're not standing on perhaps, some of the stock, or they're not just grabbing a chair. We saw this particularly with the teaching profession, where everybody, we know that teachers will just grab a chair and stand on it and put something on the ceiling. But again, an awful lot of accidents happen because people do that, because chairs aren't meant for standing on, or somebody putting a chair on a desk if the chair isn't high enough. All of these things we know happen, but people aren't necessarily sort of thinking about some of the risks and the access equipment that they need to use. One of the other things as well is more consideration of industry-led guidance, and I think this is particularly important in terms of the role that Access Industry Forum play. HSE has been working with AIF over a number of years, as Neil mentioned earlier, and I think now there is a huge range of industry-led guidance being produced. So it isn't just HSE saying, we're the regulation, this is what you must do. It's industry coming to us and saying, actually, we've got the expertise working in a particular area. We want to put together some guidance. Will you work with us to do that? And then obviously, a number of these organisations have huge numbers of members, and for HSE it really means that we can get some of those really good practice and safe messages on equipment use and the like out there. And then finally, one of the other things we've seen a lot more of is more thought being given to appropriate use of access equipment and selection of access equipment. HSE is contacted by quite a range of people talking about new and innovative ways to access things. So often our inspectors are asked to sort of comment on different bits of access equipment, not from a commercial point of view to endorse it or anything like that, but rather to say, well, is this something safe, and actually does this address an access issue problem? So again, a company contacted us recently with using basically the idea of water-fed extension poles, but using the extension pole idea for putting things up in retail outlets or on ceilings in schools. So again, sort of working with HSE, they were asking for our input on that, and we've made our sort of field staff aware of this very simple, straightforward, but really quite a safe way of doing something where before there had been some risks. So in terms of the impact of fall from height, I'm sure people here have all seen similar sorts of things like this. You're walking down the street, or perhaps in some of the work that you've done. But here's the real sorts of risks that our field staff are seeing, our operational inspectors when they're out and about. Here you can see some of the ladders are too short, the individual's not necessarily attached to anything. We're not sure if the scaffold is fixed to the wall. There's very little edge protection there. And it's highly unlikely if one of these guys fell, whether or not they'd actually walk away from that. So it's these sorts of things. This isn't a construction build, this is just a maintenance job. But here, really, very little thought has been given to some of the risks. And there's some very simple, cost-effective things that people could do here to make this sort of job quite safe. As I mentioned earlier as well, there's also this sort of growing concern around sole traders. I say mainly individuals working by themselves. So sort of the white van man, basically, where they're going out and doing quick fixes, perhaps on domestic premises, perhaps on commercial premises. But because they're working by themselves, obviously they're completely responsible for their health and safety. And there isn't anybody there to sort of offer that check, and perhaps they're not aware of some of the safety, the very simple steps that they can take to prevent an accident happening to themselves. I'll just show you a clip here which we used in the Shattered Lives campaign when that was running, which I think probably summarises it.
Terry, finish it today.
Don't put that there, Dave.
Oh, what now?
No, not yet.
Yes, I will tell them. It's a 25th wedding anniversary.
Accidents at work can shatter lives, so find out how to avoid them. Call us now or search online for Shattered Lives.
So as I say, it's little things like that where individuals sort of say, oh, don't do that, mate, and then he has, and then somebody's had quite a nasty fall where, I mean, it shows the image shattering, that was the whole point of the campaign, but I mean, a broken leg, I think they'd probably be quite lucky if they walked away with a broken leg, if not something worse. So it's these kinds of things. And there, obviously there was somebody who was meant to be acting as the supervisor for the work. They weren't particularly doing their job. But also the individual, if they'd just been working by themselves, this is one of the areas of risk that HSE is coming across, I would say probably increasingly. So it's something that we're quite keen really is to make sure that small businesses and people working by themselves are really taking some simple steps. So just having a little look then at some of the incident trends. As I say, I've pulled together some of the stats from 2009-10, so these are the most up-to-date ones. And again, the top three were the areas I mentioned around construction, retail and land transport. So this is going to be things like HGV drivers, and it's mainly to do with people walking across trailers and perhaps falling down. But that's around 31% of all falls from height injuries are happening in these three areas. And as I say, over 60% of fatalities are in construction. Construction is obviously making up a large part of that, but that doesn't, as I said earlier, doesn't mean to say that people are going to be sort of 10 metres up on a scaffold. This is a whole range of heights of falls. I think around about 2/3 actually of these falls from height are people who are falling from a much, much lower level, where they're still suffering quite serious injury. In terms of the agents then, and this is just a word that HSE uses to describe the type of equipment or the thing that was involved in the falls from height. The top one there, which I explained earlier, was to do with the recoding, and this is to do with steps and stairs, so people falling down steps and stairs. 12% they're movable ladders. And again, I would stress this isn't because ladders are a bad thing, this is because people probably aren't using them correctly. HSE's Ladder Exchange Initiative has been one of the ways that we've been trying to get people to think about ladder safety, working with Ladder Association, Ladder and Fencing Industries, who I think are here tomorrow, and others. Really getting them to think about, checking your ladder before it's used, because it is a good bit of equipment to use for certain jobs. And then furniture, which is interesting to me because furniture isn't any sort of access equipment and really shouldn't be used for any sort of climbing or work at height. I think what's also interesting when I looked at this sort of list of the top agents, other than ladders, and I would say I think that's more to do with faulty ladders being used or unsafe ladders or the competence issue, there actually isn't any access equipment in that list. So again, there's quite a strong theme there around the falls from height when they're happening aren't happening necessarily where people are using things like scaffold properly or mutes or cherry pickers or anything like that. It's because people are either not using anything or they're using something incorrectly. One of the, as I mentioned earlier, one of the top sort of fatal fall agents being involved. One of the top sort of fatal fall agents being involved is, again, working around fragile roofs. So again, that's something where I think people aren't necessarily aware of what a fragile roof is and really need to think about, well, it's not just working on a roof. Are there any sort of skylights or weak areas of corrugated roofing that I need to be aware of? And then taking sort of precautions around how they actually work on or around that area. And because it is one of the things which people are not necessarily acknowledging when they're doing their sort of straightforward risk assessment before the work. So we sort of touched upon some of these this morning in terms of the common factors that HSE sees causing falls from height. Planning of work, so it's a quick job, and I think that's a particular issue where you are working by yourself. Something quick can be done very straightforward. You've got the ladder on the van, and then an accident can happen. Supervision, and we saw that in the Shattered Lives video clip, people actually making sure they're supervising what somebody's doing. And often we hear about people saying, well, I'm just told to do it, and it's quite difficult. We do recognise the pressures that individuals can feel if they're working on a big site and they're just told to do the job and to get on with it. It can be quite difficult to say, well, no, I don't think it's safe. But again, supervision and the responsibilities there are quite important. Selection of equipment, so making sure that people are using the right equipment for the job. And equipment safety as well. Again, this is something which colleagues in construction asked me to sort of emphasise today, is that people are using equipment and the equipment might be safe and they'll just get on with it and use it. But they won't necessarily be thinking, well, okay, what if something goes wrong once the equipment's in use? So it's really important to spend that time before you use something like a mute or anything like that to make sure you're familiar with the equipment. So if something does go wrong, if somebody gets crushed or trapped or stranded in the mute while it's in use, that you have a rescue plan for them. You know what to do to get them back down again safely. Because it's too late once somebody's stuck up there, or if actually somebody's experiencing some sort of injury because something's gone wrong. It's really important and quite easy to get that out of the way beforehand, and then the work can carry on safely. Competence, so I think that runs across everything, to be honest, making sure that you know what you're doing and you know what you're using, and then fragile roofs and lone workers, which I've already touched on this morning. So the control measures here, and these will be very familiar to everybody in the room. Again, it's all risk-based, and it's about a judgment that you make as an individual, whether you're supervising the work or whether or not you're doing it yourself. But the three principles, again, avoiding work at height where possible, and this doesn't mean just not doing the work, it means using some of the alternatives that are now available where it's reasonable. So you have things like water-fed extension poles, or you have extension equipment poles that you can use in retail and that kind of thing. Where it's right to work at height, fine, just make sure that you prevent people falling, or you mitigate if there is that risk of falling. So again, it's not sort of saying these things shouldn't happen, it's just asking people to think through the risk-based processes when they're doing it. And then there's some comments here around the risk assessment, thinking about the precautions, recording any significant findings, and making sure that you take some mitigation where you think there is a risk of something happening. And also making sure it's a live document. Risk assessments aren't meant to be done and then left on a shelf. They are meant to be something usable that is used during the lifetime of the work. But I think the main thing here is that for many organisations, this is all going to be common sense. You'll be very familiar with what you're doing. If you're going out to do a maintenance job, or if you're going out to clean windows or whatever, you will have done it, I'm sure, hundreds of times before. So it's just making sure that you use your common sense, and that's been one of the things that came out from the Law General Report, Common Sense, Common Safety. It's about using your common sense, using your understanding and expertise about the job that you're doing to make sure that you do it as safely as possible. One of the things that HSE has done, about a year ago we developed the weight tool. I'm not sure if anyone here has seen this. But again, it was to help people in selection of access equipment, because we were quite conscious that with these sort of myths about ladders being banned and everybody having to suddenly, hire very expensive equipment, etc., we wanted to make sure that people knew that wasn't the case, but also they had a bit more of a steer from us as a regulator about when they could use different sorts of equipment. So if you haven't had a look at it, I do recommend you have a look. If you are very familiar with access equipment and you work in that sort of industry, this will be quite simplistic, I would imagine. But again, if you are doing different types of work at height, perhaps you work by yourself, we hope it's going to be quite useful. You can put in things like the height of work that you'll be working at. You can put in if you need the equipment to be movable or if you want it to be fixed. You can also put in whether or not it's light duty or heavy duty work. And then basically it will give you a range of types of access equipment that would be suitable for the work. So it discounts the ones which are going to be risky. And it includes those which you can then consider for use to do the job. So again, have a look at it. This is one of the things which Neil mentioned earlier as well, that we were going to be working with Access Industry Forum on, because it is a web-based tool and we're very conscious that not everybody has ready access to the internet when they're out and about. It's not necessarily practical. So we are looking at how we can actually take some of the main bits of information off this and put it into some sort of portable format for people to take out with them on jobs. Then finally, the what next? Well, this makes me smile because obviously we're going through a huge period of change at the moment within the public sector, and HSE is part of that. I think one of the things that it is for us, it's a real chance to start to continue to work in partnership with organisations that we have been like AIF, but also to start new partnerships as well. There's some things that we know will be carrying on. So there's a European Safe Maintenance campaign which has been running all of last year, and that will carry on through this year as well. Mentioned that we'll be looking to develop the weight tool because selection of access equipment is a really important part of making sure you work at height safely. Emerging energy technologies is something particularly again to do with domestic installation. Again, often where there are health and safety professionals working in larger organisations that do this sort of work, you might think that there's sort of less of a concern. Where you have individuals who might do domestic installations, so photovoltaic panels, domestic wind turbines, cavity wall insulation, these sorts of things, we need to make sure that HSE is working with the right organisations so that competence and thinking about access equipment for this work is considered quite early on. I mentioned ladder exchange earlier, and I think this is something which HSE really wants to carry on this year. We exchanged about 1,200 ladders last year, which have now been taken out of use, and that was through input and support from AIF members like Ladder Association. We now have around 19 retail partners who are involved in this, and we hope to add more to that this year. So there really is, every opportunity for people, if they've got a faulty ladder or a damaged ladder that they want to change, to go along to one of the retail outlets during the exchange and get a new one. About 8,000 ladders, I think just over 8,000 ladders have been taken out of circulation through the exchange. So it's quite a simple thing, but it does have a really good effect. And hopefully by taking some of these unsafe bits of equipment out of use, we can help to prevent accidents. And then finally, as I say, continuing to work in partnership with the industry. An example of this recently, I think that HSE supported the development of best practice guidance on mutes with the plant industry, and that's now available. And again, it's something that we're quite keen to do because I think HSE should be working to support industry-led guidance as well as producing our own. But it's really great when industry and trade associations are taking ownership for some of these problems and that they can share their expertise and experience of how these things are happening in practice with us. So finally, just a few web links up there, Falls from Height web pages where all being sort of reviewed at the moment, so all of the guidance and things like that is being refreshed and kept up to date. Ladder Exchange webpage, we hopefully will be able to make an announcement about whether that's going ahead. We're very much committed to it going ahead, so we think it will probably something going up there in around about July or August. And again, we hope to have more retail partners on board this year. And then finally, the Work at Height Access Equipment Information Toolkit, the weight tool. As I say, it's quite a simple idea, but hopefully it will be quite useful in helping people make some of those routine decisions about access equipment that they use. And thank you very much for your time. Thank you.